So we have a cover crop here of wheat that is just getting established. We're going to let it go for about 3 weeks and then terminate it. We get a lot of good energy pumped into the soil from terminating a very lush and green cover crop, even though it's not going to reach full maturity. We're going to be turning a lot of sugars back into the soil, which is going to feed the microbiological life and replenish the energy that they need to sustain themselves and repair damage to the soil that we did this past spring. You can kind of see off in the distance that there's kind of a dip in this field, and we did some damage to it this spring by working it a little bit too wet. It was a very wet spring, had very narrow windows to get in, and sometimes we got in a little bit sooner than we should have. So we're trying to pump as much energy back into the soil to feed it and to make it as productive in the coming seasons as possible. And cover crops is a great way to do that. It's also a great way to discourage weeds from coming up, because when you feed the microbiological life, there's more activity there. They're going to work to help minimize compaction and other issues where weeds like grasses that we see that we had here in this field this spring thrive in those wet, compacted, and poorly drained soils. So this is one way that cover crops can help both feed the soil and also fight weeds as well. So you can see the wheat coming up here. The wheat is just germinating, and so are these little grasses, and this is some amaranth here. The wheat is going to have an advantage over the weeds because it's already larger. It will shade out the weeds faster. By having a quick turnaround cover crop of this wheat, we will turn in that energy that the wheat generates back into the soil, as well as terminate all of these little weeds, which may still put on a seed head if we had a larger or a longer termed cover crop going into the winter. So here's an example of one of our bed systems that we have on the farm. Since we do have a fair bit of weed pressure, we cultivate all of our crops. Something to strive towards for crops like this is maybe a high density cedar, but those planters make the crop less cultivatable. But because we're direct seeding things like baby mustard greens and arugula salad mix, our setup is very important. And you can see here we do 5-10 inch rows, and everything is pretty much set up spot on, so we can cultivate either direction, and that cultivator can be used for a crop like these baby mustard greens, lettuce mix that is just behind it, or radishes. These crops were planted into flat ground. The only raise you see here is what the tractor tires compacted down a little bit. When we seeded, it would be beneficial to have put these crops on a raised bed. We just got some pretty heavy rains this past week. Putting your crops on a raised bed does allow the soil to dry out faster. It helps prevent some disease because typically you get better drainage. And also, maybe today the soil is drying out pretty nicely, but it is still a little bit on the wetter side. So if we had put these crops on a raised bed, then we probably could be cultivating, at least a day sooner than, we will be, because they're on flat land. And what I'm looking for is just making sure that I can't, make a ball out of the soil. If you can make a ball out of the soil and it stays together, then it's probably too wet to be cultivating. or doing any type of tillage work. This is our fall broccoli field, and it's got a different setup than our 5-row crops do. This is on a 2-row system, which would fit into the cultivation setup of the Alice Chalmers G that we saw earlier with the finger weeders. Although this crop is actually too big now to use finger weeders on, in my opinion, we will use a setup with the older American style row crop sweeps to eradicate the weeds for the last time in this field. So these are two 30-inch rows. I'm standing in a wheel track right now, and it's a very consistent setup for all of these crops here. So we can go from cultivating cauliflower over here to broccoli to cabbage. We're still kind of a little bit too wet to be cultivating right now, but as you can see, for the most part, all of these weeds that have come up here will either be able to be eradicated by the sweeps, or the sweeps will actually be throwing more soil into the row, and that will in turn then cover up these smaller weeds here. So that's when timing gets to be very important for controlling weeds. So you can actually do a lot with very little with the old school sweeps, not being super accurate, but using what they're good at to your advantage and exploiting the advantage of the size of the crop over the weeds to get really effective weed control.